Today, as we celebrate International Women's Day, there's a question that we are trying to answer, which is how can something as helpful as technology also become so dangerous? And more importantly, how do we find fixes?
Direct form of tech-facilitated gender-based violence is when there is some sort of intimate abuse of images, AI-generated sexually explicit content associated with a particular person. Somebody's personal information is leaked out.
But there is a very pervasive, persistent systems of violence against women. And of course, they take different structures because our patriarchy is well entrenched.
Now, this year at Meta is a top-down, change in policy where issues related to gender are not as important anymore in the moderation of content on social media.
So hello and welcome to the first podcast by UNDP, first podcast ever here in Pakistan. So today we're talking about a very important and emerging subject. It's urgent and it's deeply personal at the same time. Tech-facilitated gender-based violence, or TFGBV. And in this particular case, we're talking about, the subtext of this is breaking the silence. Very happy that you're all here. I'll introduce everyone in just a minute. So today, as we celebrate International Women's Day, there's a question that we are trying to answer, which is how can something as helpful as technology also become so dangerous? And more importantly, how do we find fixes for this? And to explore this discussion, I'm very grateful to three guests who are with me today. The Honorable Dr. Nafisa Shah. Long bio, but I'll share the short version. Member of Pakistan's National Assembly and chairperson of the Special Committee on Gender Mainstreaming, has served as vice president of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. Amna Baig, superintendent of Police Service of Pakistan. Currently a deputy director at FIA, holds a master's degree in public policy, also University of Oxford, and established Pakistan's first gender protection unit to increase access to justice for the marginalized. Usama Khilji, welcome to you as well, director of Bolo Bhi, a policy and advocacy organization focused on digital rights and civic education, and also vice chair of the Global Network Initiative, a global multi-stakeholder collaboration to protect freedom of expression and privacy in tech. So welcome to all three of you. Pleased that you could join us on this very special day. So we'll have an informal discussion. I have a number of questions just to start, and then we will have, obviously, a dialogue. So tech-facilitated gender-based violence, TFGBV, appears complicated, and that's why I think it's important to start with a definition to try to simplify it for everyone that's actually listening to us today. So to break this down from a very complicated concept into an easy to understand perspective, we want to make sure we're all sort of on the same page. So I actually start with Amna. Please tell us how you understand tech-facilitated gender-based violence in general as a definition and what it means today in Pakistan. Is it actually different from the more traditional forms of GBV that we have heard about now for some time?
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for this important discussion. I think when we talk about TFGBV, and my colleagues over here would agree that there's no set definition for it as such. However, there could be understanding of the concept in different ways. And the way I understand it as a law enforcement officer is that I look at it in two different perspectives. So tech-facilitated gender-based violence, any sort of violence that is perpetrated through the use of media, social media and digital gadgets, is what is tech-facilitated gender-based violence. But also the definition of TFGBV can be bifurcated in itself as well. So for example, there are two types. The first is the direct form of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. So what do we mean by direct form of tech-facilitated gender-based violence? Direct form of tech-facilitated gender-based violence is when there is some sort of intimate abuse of images, AI-generated sexually explicit content associated with a particular person. Somebody's personal information is leaked out. So all of these tangible acts that are committed on social media through digital gadgets is what is direct form of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And this form is also, in most cases, cognizable, which means that it can be reported to the criminal justice system. But then there is another form of TFGB which I believe is extremely important. It is the indirect form of TFGBV, where you do not have, you have abuse in places of leaking of images. You have somebody harassing you, but not explicitly. You have anonymous accounts, going in with a lot of hate for you as a person. But these types of TFGBV are not cognizable as such. So you do not take account of it in that way. And that is indirect form of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And when we talk about TFGBV, we have to address both. Why? Because both of them equally impact women's and trans persons' participation in the socioeconomic development of a country. So, for example, if women politicians get three times more hate than their male colleagues, hate as such in the forms of abuse cannot be reported to a police station, but it is impacting somebody's participation on that particular platform, which has become extremely important for political engagement. How do you deal with that? That is the indirect form of TFGBV. However, when we talk about the direct form of TFGB, we have cases where AI-generated images have led to serious offline repercussions. It leads to honor killings in a conservative society like ours. We have seen, and I think my colleagues would agree with me on that, is the fact that these big tech social media platforms, they are prioritizing engagement over safety. So if there is some sort of negative content that is getting a lot of traction on a particular social media platform, it will have way more reach than a content which is not that negative in nature. So we have to take all of these things keep in mind when we're talking about TFGBV. It is important to define it in these particular aspects, because when we're talking about solutions, we have to revert back to these definitions.
So we have the definition, we have what you heard from Amna, direct and indirect violence. As a parliamentarian, you are entrusted with drafting policy and enacting laws that in many cases are now being pushed to actually address issues that may not have been popular or even important 10, 20, 30, or 40 years ago. That's why today we are talking not only about GBV, we're talking about tech-facilitated GBV. So if I may ask you, also in Parliament, what steps have already been taken by government, by Parliament, to strengthen these laws and policies to prevent and respond to tech-facilitated GBV? And how effective do you see these measures for accountability purposes, particularly?
The technology adds another dimension, but there is a very pervasive, persistent systems of violence against women. And of course, they take different structures because our patriarchy is well entrenched. There is the honor-based violence, and there is, the domestic violence, the sexual harassment. And all these, of course, there is a cultural, socio-economic context to it, which is entrenched. So this is perhaps another tool or another. So I would caution in making it an entity in itself rather than contextualizing it within the larger framework of violence against women. I think that Pakistan is still coming to grips with this and even the parliament. So the PICA law, and interestingly enough, the PICA law has become now, a center of focus of controversy, not because it tries to address the online GBV, but because it has become a tool for surveillance. So one has to see the different dimensions that are at play. But yes, it is the PICA law, the 2016 specifically, that tries to address this violence, online violence against women or harassment. And I think that there is quite a comprehensive coverage of all kinds. But what the parliament is lacking now today is a post-legislative scrutiny. So I'm actively trying to campaign for a forum where we can undertake post-legislative scrutiny in a systematic way. Until and unless we do not know that, we will not know the shortcomings. We have to do it very systematically to see what are the roadblocks in for instance, the definitions, how are they being applied, the inquiries, the institutions responsible for the inquiries. So all these are things that I think the Parliament, going forward, I would really call for perhaps a hearing on post-legislative scrutiny of the PICA law to see what are the shortcomings.
So I think this is one thing that we hear often in Pakistan. There's no shortage of policy nor law, or in many cases, implementation of the law. It's actual scrutiny and accountability after that. And in many cases, perhaps also for the case of tech-facilitated GBV, it's how long it takes to actually legislate some of these issues. And the ability of women, particularly girls, women, to actually feel confident enough to be able to report this. Let me go to Usama and basically ask, from your particular perspective, what do you see in social media and digital platforms that have already changed the landscape of GBV? And what are some of the most common challenges that you see or you hear from your engagement with either a lot of folks working on victim assistance or victim response or advocacy? Would love to hear some of the stories that you might also bring from that particular research and civil society perspective.
We've spoken a lot about the definition and about the Parliament's role, but when it comes to the platforms, there's still a lot to be done. And what we're seeing lately with the changes at Twitter when it became X, and now this year at Meta, is a top-down, change in policy where issues related to gender are not as important anymore in the moderation of content on social media. And even when you look at the community standards that these platforms have, there's a lot of enforcement issues that exist. So for example, if in a lot of cases in civil society organizations such as ours, which is Bolo Bhi, in Pakistan, we also have the Digital Rights Foundation. A lot of people reach out to us when the platforms fail to, address the issues that they're facing. So for example, if you report content on the platforms, a lot of times they will not take down the content even if it is dangerous. Having said that, not everyone has the opportunity to reach out to an organization. And if you have, more than 90 million active social media users in the country, the numbers really speak for themselves. And then if we're looking at additional enforcement, the issues are that the platforms don't prioritize languages other than the English language. So if you're a victim or survivor of violence online and the content targeting you is in Urdu or in Pashto or in Sindhi or Balochi or any of the other regional languages, the social media platforms do not have enough resources dedicated to this. Keeping that in mind, we have to keep underscoring the point that the definition of gender-based violence and the definition of harassment within our context, varies from that we see globally otherwise. And then I want to come to the role of this state. I think it's imperative that this state not only, prosecute and divert sufficient resources to law enforcement to deal with this, which we see lacking currently, but also invest in, education related to gender-based violence. So what is the role of men in, protecting women? And what is the role of men in respecting women? That has to be taught. And unless that is taught, we will continue with the same sort of patriarchal culture that we see today. So Amna spoke about the definition of hate speech, but in Pakistani legislation, including in PICA, the definition of hate speech is restricted to religion, ethnic, and sect-based hate speech. But we don't have any gender-based hate speech that's defined, and hence that cannot be prosecuted. So the crimes that you have in PICA outlined are related to once the crime has taken place. So once you're photos have been edited and put out there, or once pornography has been put out, child pornography is included. But if someone's threatening you, then there's little legal recourse that you have in that case. Or if someone is making hateful speech based on gender, then also the legal lacunas exist in relation to that.
So when we talk about inclusion, especially women's economic empowerment, being included in the market, being counted, etc., we're often talking about how to include through digital means. So we're talking about including women through digital means, and then we're still saying at the same time, but be careful, this is an unsafe medium. And I think that's important. So how do we actually encourage this kind of trend towards more inclusion along these spaces? But at the same time, we have no real way of protecting the masses that presumably can be included online, given where we are in terms of the numbers of officers and the numbers of offices. And these 15 offices, if I understand correctly, are physical offices, whereas you need maybe online tools to report online problems.
Until and unless access to justice is improved, we will keep seeing the impunity that we already see in the cases of TFGBV. I looked at all the cases of complaints that were filed by women politicians, including former Minister for Law and Justice. Since 2018 till now, I think there were 25 complaints altogether, and none of them completed trial. So we're talking about women who are in a position of power, who have all the resources at their hands to pursue their cases, and still we see that there is massive impunity. And one of the main reasons for this particular issue is the limited resources. So the resources not just limited in terms of material resources, but also human resources. As you pointed out, we have approximately 200 investigating officers in FIA that are looking at complaints of cybercrimes. And on average, each officer is looking at 900 plus complaints a year. So you can well imagine the quality of investigation in cases of TFGBV and cybercrime altogether. We must also discuss the limited amount of investigative budgets that they have. We must also discuss that this is a different crime, a different type of gender crime than the regular traditional gender crimes that we have had, because it is transnational in nature. As Usama pointed out, we need data from social media platforms, and until and unless we have that back-end data, we cannot prosecute a case. It must be informative for the public to know that you cannot file a complaint against an anonymous account. So if an anonymous account is perpetrating violence against you on any social media platforms, the law does not have any recourse for you. So where do you go? And that's the sort of issues that we need to address. We should also look at, as Usama pointed out, there are issues with the law itself. When we look at the complaints, majority of the complaints in regards to TFGBV are complaints of blackmailing. And the law in its fair reading does not provide you a solution to the problem, because it says that the material or the content needs to be transmitted, shared, etc., etc. So until and unless it's shared, the law cannot, help you out. So it is these very technical things in regards to the complaints, as Dr. Shah pointed out, that we need to go back and see how the law is faring. And it's so important to involve, I believe, the law enforcement officers who are at the front end dealing with the complaints, because the nature of the complaints are changing every day. With the change in technology, we see that there is a new type of, TFGBV that is being perpetrated. So the conversations need to be very, very inclusive. Right now, the solutions, again, of course, lie in the existing resources that we have. The local police stations, because they already have a good network, should be utilized for the in-person verification requirements. We need to go back and provide trainings to those police officers who are trained in the traditional policing models and have no idea how to go about the cyber. So it's a task that requires a lot of effort from the state, from the civil society organization, and a lot of willpower at this stage, political will, I'd say.
So Usama, after we've heard some of this now, and I know that you've spoken also about where the PICA law is so far, What particular improvement would you actually suggest, given your own research and experience and discussing with civil society, to actually target in some of the PICA legislation issues of TFGBV? I think Amna spoke a little bit about this, but is there one or two things that you can actually stick in there to say this actually makes a difference and may in many cases appear irreversible, so that we don't actually go back, we continue to move forward?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things in the PICA law that make it difficult for women. One thing is the criminal defamation aspect within the PICA law. So in Section 20, and actually this was struck down by the Islamabad High Court in April 2022, the part affecting reputation. What that did was that when the Me Too movement started, and a lot of brave women started speaking out about harassment that they'd faced and used social media to talk about it, a lot of the harassers then started filing defamation cases against the women who were speaking out. So essentially it was the law was being used to silence women to talk about, gender-based violence that they'd faced. And what we've seen is with the latest amendment in the law, now sharing false information, quote unquote, is also punishable by 3 years in jail. And I was very happy to hear Dr. Shah talk about post-legislative scrutiny of PICA. And Dr. Shah and her party were amongst those who tried to improve the PICA law when it was being formulated in 2016.
Thanks very much, Usama. So maybe I'll go back to Amna for a second. I'll share some numbers and I'll tell you where I'm going with this in just a second. So in Pakistan, 240 million plus, about 111 million people, about 45% of the population are connected to the internet, give or take maybe a couple of million. Penetration rates are actually increasing, with about 27 million additional users connected between January 2023 and January 2024. So more people are joining. The numbers for female ownership of mobile broadband connections are actually going up from 21% in 2021 to 24%. So there's a bit of a narrowing of the gap. And a lot of this is actually connected to the private sector. This is the private sector that's actually mentioning this. And I know we talk a lot about very, very bad statistics on, where Pakistan is in the global parity index for gender, et cetera, et cetera. But here's one number that is actually positive, that comes out of our National Human Development Report from last year, with a focus on digital transformation. That brings about the question, which is, under other circumstances, perhaps we could have had the private sector with us, including from the platforms that were mentioned here. But where do you see, perhaps in your engagement and from your particular perspective, a potential engagement with the private sector on all things TFGBV? We heard about reluctance. We heard about now there might appear to be less content management rather than more content management. But what does that actually look like when you engage with the private sector and you say, here, these are the numbers, there are particular issues, how can you help us?
This is the first time that the gender-based violence is not just limited to a jurisdiction which is within Pakistan, right? This is the first time that gender-based violence has become transnational. So in order for me to prosecute somebody for TFGBV, I need to engage with these private partners to get the data to ensure that there is accountability. As Dr. Shah said, that we're still trying to understand the problem. We're just trying to see how can we come up with good solutions for it. And to be honest, in certain cases, that's exactly the case with the private sector as well. So most of the times when we have engaged with them in conversations, as Usama said, that the contextualization of their community guidelines is the most important thing at this point. But it took Meta so many years to come to a point where they have recently started contextualizing their community guidelines. And their community guidelines are universal and global in nature. But in my country, in Pakistan, if somebody's pictures come out a woman's picture come out in a conservative household with, where she's not wearing clothes with sleeves on, I think her life is in danger. But the community guidelines do not address that problem. That's where I think it's so important to globally address this issue, because most of these policies are being made in the global north and their repercussions are here on us in the global south. So those discussions have become extremely important, especially platform accountability, specifically platform accountability for platforms who are reluctant to share information. So it's not just the compliance report from the FIA that does not go to the parliament that you're talking. It's also the compliance report that the platforms are supposed to share, which they're not sharing.
So the discussion, I think, so far has been focusing on gender-based violence, the tech facilitated perspective of which, and I think we have almost a perspective in our mind on who that is. It's women, it's girls. But I feel that if we dug a little bit deeper, also based on our previous discussions, we might be able to find that this particular effect on a number of other populations, key individuals, individuals in particular positions, who almost appear just as vulnerable and just as helpless to be able to speak out. So maybe this is a particular question to Dr. Nafisa. Who do you see are actually to be included among the vulnerable populations to tech-facilitated gender-based violence?
Particularly, I want to also point out that women in the public space who are, it could be working women, it could be women in the entertainment industry, but particularly I want to point out that women politicians are also vulnerable. So even myself, for instance, as politicians, our first exposure to online violence was abusive content on Twitter. I mean, you say something really in a nice way, and then you are attacked with a barrage of very offensive messages. You go towards solutions and you talk about prevention. It's also important that these categories of women who are susceptible or vulnerable, no matter how powerful or strong they are, would still need some kind of, support system on how to address or how to resolve this kind of content that comes their way. Many of us have learned to ignore. We ignore a lot of things. Some of us have responded, but when politicians respond, it is seen as something that is adversarial to the people. So if I, for instance, take a position against any online harassment that I've had and I go public against it, then, I face that backlash also of being, not nice about it, where you're expected to be tolerant. The law must not be restricted to the punitive regime. Oh, if you say it like this, then you have 3 months. If you say it like this, then you have 6 months imprisonment and a fine of this and a fine of that. There is this whole the intermediary space where you need to overcome all this. There are psychological aspects, how it affects your personal life, how it generally affects the way you work. It may restrain you. All these barriers. These are so it's just not trying to resolve the issue through legalistic means and punitive means, but also the other things, the other spaces where you have support organizations, where you have psychological and then education on how to deal with all this.
Which may be a good segue back to Usama. And I think you mentioned two things that are important. One is prevention and one is protection. And I think to a great extent, both of them are needed. And some of that responsibility, perhaps, and the ability to be aware, skilled, informed, lies on the person themselves. In this case, a woman politician, people in public spaces, young girls, etc. I mean, I have two young daughters as well. I think I was shocked in the beginning to know that they actually have multiple Instagram accounts, and I only know about one.
Finsta.
And it's often a case of awareness. I can only tell them what everybody knows. If it's on the internet, it's on the internet forever. Be aware, don't get bullied, all of these things. So I think the prevention and protection aspect is important. But to go back to Usama, including in a lot of the awareness work that you actually do, What do you inform, instruct, make aware to a lot of participants in some of your sessions, for example, as women, or as emerging leaders for that matter, to know what's the responsibility of the person, what is the responsibility of the community? And I think maybe that's a good way to sort of wrap up, and then we go around and we hear from all of.
So we do a range of digital safety and security workshops that are tailored for different segments of populations. So we do some for children in schools, for younger kids. We do some for human rights defenders, some for journalists. And then we've often also had open to public digital security sessions in public spaces where we give a call. And what we've realized is that, yes, it's important to tell women and young girls what not to do so that they don't get harassed. But that's not a solution, because we're effectively blaming the victims. We're saying, oh, don't post a photo like this so that someone doesn't harass you. But we're not talking enough about who is the one harassing them. And are those and is that segment of the population being educated not to harass and to respect? And I think that responsibility lies with the community. Are we teaching our young boys and men on how to use social media responsibly, how not to comment on women's bodies online when they're talking about politics, how not to be abusive, and how not to perpetuate that gendered hate speech, and not to threaten young girls and women if they don't accede to their demands, and how to respect the notion of consent. So I think all of that rests online also. If someone is not responding to your message, you stop messaging them. And luckily, the PICA Section 24 deals with cyber stalking, in which it particularly says that if you keep messaging someone and they express disinterest and you keep contacting them, then you can be liable under the Section 24 of PICA for cyber stalking. But I think the community has to do a better job of educating their young boys and men, rather than only preparing girls to be the perfect victims. I think that's key. And then other than that, I think the certainty of punishment has to be there. So there's no point of having Section 24 and 22 and 21 of PICA if it's not being enforced. So men know, yeah, there is this law, but I'm going to get away with threatening a girl. I'm going to get away with issuing rape threats. And I'm going to get away with, morphing non-consensual intimate imagery and putting it out there, and there'll be no consequences for me. So then they'll continue to engage in that sort of behavior. So I think that certainty of the law has to be there to act as a deterrent, because so far it's not. And like Amna earlier mentioned, the political will to enforce that has to be there.
Thank you very much, Amna, especially on that last point. So visible vocal solidarity, I think, is important. A lot of people sympathize, a lot of people think this is important, but I think the visible part of it is not entirely clear. So maybe I'd like to close by inviting Dr. Nafisa maybe to think about, policy and legislation for the future. AI generation, the tech facilitated anything, let alone GBV, is actually going to grow. And I'd like to hear from you on, what you think are some particular areas that you in your tenure currently might think about in terms of tech-facilitated GBV, knowing what you know now, and basically trying to get the law and policy to stay ahead of the curve, which is, I think, important at this point. What would that look like?
That is difficult. Politicians or public representatives are often far behind the people, although we should be a step ahead, as you said.
Reactive rather than
as you said, and that's why I held on to the idea of post-legislative scrutiny, because half the time we don't know what's happening. So yes, but first we will look for evidence as to what is happening in terms of how the present law is being implemented. But also, I think one thing that we often forget, we make the law and then we just forget about it. So I spoke about post-legislative scrutiny, but an important aspect is the making of rules, also the processes. What is we say the life of the case, the law? from the point of the complaint, how is it dealt with? So what about the processes? And I think women, the problem is also women's access to justice is the process. How do you make your case? How do you reach the institution? How accessible are the institutions? So I think we will or should be looking at the processes. And I will also be looking forward to what kind of case law is coming up. How is the judiciary? Because in the cycle of the law, the judiciary is the final arbiter of what the law is. The law often follows, but the judiciary is the final arbiter. So we would be also looking at how the case law is developing. So looking at all these, one could move forward in sort of, reforming on the law or adding some other dimensions. Also looking at data protection. I think all this increasing, we now have so many different authorities. There is a fear by the state of the social media. And whatever policy is coming out is out of that fear. And we are entangling ourselves in over-institutionalization, which is often taking away from as I said, the digital access to digital rights. And perhaps all this needs some kind of unpacking, and we have to make sense of it. And also make law a little more humble, a little more modest, and also look at how it's being implemented and then take it from there. That is how I would, but of course, for me, data protection and digital rights are very important, even equally important for women, because if a woman knows her digital rights, what to do, where, how to block, that is equally empowering for her to be able to safeguard herself against this kind of onslaught.
So I think from today's discussion, I'm really grateful that you joined us for this first ever, I guess, UNDP Pakistan podcast. And I think it is important that this is actually happening on International Women's Day. I've learned quite a bit just in doing the background and the research, and from what I've heard today. Digital literacy, policy, law, data protection, and many other things, advocacy, engagement, work with the private sector, I think are really quite important as far as Pakistan's digital space. But in this particular case, knowing is important. Digital literacy is actually important as well. And then thirdly, I think is if we're really looking for empowered individuals, they really have to be empowered to report and to be hopeful that they will actually be taken seriously. And I think that's important as well. And I think we've heard that the trends are actually growing in the number of people that are able to either report, investigate, legislate, but also advocate and really understand what that is. I think it is important then ultimately that this digital space continues to be a place of equality and fairness rather than a place of fear and stigma. Again, we really appreciate that you've joined me today and looking forward to what comes next on tech-facilitated GBV and addressing this particular phenomenon.